Well, welcome everybody, and on behalf of Pivotal, it's great to see you all here this evening. There's a lot of you out there. I hope you all enjoyed your dinner. I won't spend too long up on the stage, but I wanted to first of all introduce myself and tell you why this conference means something to me, tell you just a little bit about Pivotal, and then set up for a man who actually needs no introduction. So I've got a sort of thankless task introducing somebody who doesn't need to be introduced. But anyway, so as I said, my name's Hugh Williams. I think I've spent probably the last 10 years at some level at the forefront of sort of pushing innovation in interesting companies. So I spent nearly 5 years before I took the job at Pivotal working at eBay, helping sort of turn around their marketplaces business and get it back to where it rightfully should be. And then 5 years before that, working at Microsoft. I was one of the first developers to join their search effort when it was called MSN Search, helped that become Live Search and ultimately become Bing. So part of a couple of really interesting journeys there. And I bring those up because I think they're very relevant to the conference that we're at today. If you think about those challenges of working in large companies like that, you know, at some level as a developer, there's a really interesting sort of ebb and flow between things being easy, sort of being at the edge of innovation, and then things all of a sudden becoming hard and challenging with difficult sorts of problems to solve. Let me explain with a couple of stories. So when I was at eBay, I inherited a search engine there that was kind of crufty and old. It was around 7 years old, 8 years old at the time. It had sort of missed out on many of the kinds of innovations that had gone on in search. It was sort of difficult to run, difficult to manage, and we felt like we owed our customers something better. We felt like we owed them a new search engine that had all the kinds of features that you'd expect in modern search. And indeed, as it turns out, at eBay, around 70% of the purchases that happen on eBay begin with a search on eBay. So at some level, search at eBay is the most powerful way that buyers get connected to sellers. So we thought, we'll rebuild the search engine. So at some level, the team there was kind of on the forefront of sort of innovation, wanting to kind of push the limits, do something interesting. You know, the developers kind of motivated, sort of stretching the boundaries. About a year into the project, we had one of those sort of moments where we sort of ebbed back from that innovation. We decided to use Apache's HBase as the sort of fundamental tool that we'd collect data with, and we'd use to build an index that sort of fundamentally supported search. It was a pretty bold choice at the time to use Apache's HBase. It had never sort of been pushed to that scale of hundreds of millions of customers, that amount of data, that amount of real-time activity. And we found as engineers that we were sort of in one of those sort of ebb moments. You know, it was difficult. We weren't moving fast as we wanted to be. Development became complex. HBase wasn't stable. We'd put data in one side and it wouldn't come out the other. All those sorts of challenges that you get when you operate systems at the many thousands of machines kind of scale. So difficult kind of time. Ultimately, the team kind of worked it out. We launched the new search engine. We turned that on for the whole of the world, and things kind of went forward again. We had this sort of ebb and flow moment in the middle of the project. Something similar happened to me at Microsoft. We were building search, and we had it up and running, and we thought, we could probably do something better here for customers who search for local things. So you could imagine, for example, wanting to go to your search engine and type a query like bus and have it understand that probably what you meant wasn't sort of a generic bus, you wanted to know the bus timetable. Or you could type school and it would show you schools that were near you. Something sort of fairly intuitive. As it turned out, at that point in Microsoft's history, they had the infrastructure. They'd taken the time to sort of build out the infrastructure to collect all of the data and really empower the engineers to understand the data and be able to build features like that. So there's this sort of massive moment of acceleration, sort of again, moving fast on the edge of innovation because the infrastructure was there. So very quickly, within a few months, the team was able to build that feature and get it out to customers, and we knew from the measurement of the systems that it was working really well. But then again, there was this sort of moment afterwards of it kind of ebbing away because suddenly we wanted that feature to be real time. We wanted to kind of extend that feature so that you could type something that was happening in the news and immediately have the most relevant articles shown. So we need to push that pipeline to the limit of not just understanding context, but also moving at an enormous speed. So again, things kind of ebbed back. Spent a lot of time building new infrastructure, slowing down, getting things right, dealing with complexity before again the team could sort of really flow forward and really build at the speed that it wanted to build. So I've experienced this kind of ebb and flow many times. And at some level, when I think about Spring, when I think about our Spring.io team, I think that's a team that's sort of right in the center of making sure that those ebbs and those flows aren't so dramatic. You might know that eBay is a big user of Spring. There's a very, very good reason for that. It's because Spring makes sure that those ebbs are minimized and those flows come fast. It's really something that very much eBay valued as central to making their developers productive and making simple things possible, which is fantastic. I think Spring Boot is a wonderful example today of the kinds of things that this community is contributing and making that ebb and flow much less dramatic for developers of the future. I know you're going to hear tonight about microservices. Of course, at the heart of companies like Microsoft and eBay are microservices. They very much think in a service-oriented architectural way so that teams can run in parallel and move fast. But again, that creates its own complexities that you'll hear about tonight, where things sometimes ebb before they'll flow. The team also works on big data problems. I think most applications of the future, I've given you a couple of examples, are going to be big data applications. I think we're moving away from a world where applications are simple and stateless to a world where applications are expected to be very, very powerful and very, very data-driven. And the Spring team and Spring in general sits at the center of that as well. But most of all, I think Spring is something that can be celebrated for really making life easier for developers. And my journey, I hope, illustrates how important that is to large companies who are really trying to innovate at scale and change the world for hundreds of millions of customers. Anyway, enough about my history. I just wanted to share with you why this community means something to me and why it's so important that the work you do. Today I'm proud to be at Pivotal, having a great time. I've just been at Pivotal for around about 8 months. I thought I might share just for a few moments what Pivotal is and why I came there. Pivotal, I think, will be one of the most important companies of our time. And I say that not just as an employee, but again because I believe in this kind of ebb and flow and the necessity of making things simple for developers so that developers can really impact the world and add true value. At its heart, Pivotal really does 4 things. So Pivotal has big data. So we have an Hadoop installation, an Hadoop distribution, I should say, an analytics data warehouse called the Greenplum database, and a really great product called Gemfire that's all about high-speed ingestion and managing data at scale in memory. So we work on big data. Again, I think that's essential for the applications of the future. We have Cloud Foundry. We're sort of one of the biggest sponsors of Cloud Foundry, a very important open source project. Again, we believe that what most developers want is a container in which they can build software and then the ability to replicate those containers at will to build applications at scale. We also, of course, do lots of work in application fabrics because this is all about empowering developers, and Spring, Groovy, and Grails are absolutely central to that. And then we have a really high-powered consulting arm called Pivotal Labs that hopefully you've heard of. It's a very popular way that corporations use these days to build software in a really, really great way that allows them to build it right once. So we think with those sort of pieces coming together that we're building a company that has all the essential pieces that developers of the future will need. And as I say, Spring very much central to that. So tonight, of course, you're going to hear lots from leaders of the communities around Spring, around Groovy, and around Grails, and I'm really looking forward to that. We're also going to hear tonight from Netflix, which I'm really excited about. So we'll be hearing about the open source community that exists there and sort of what's going on at Netflix, which should be a lot of fun. But really what I'm up here today to do is introduce, actually, as I said, somebody who needs no introduction. He's a man who has an amazing attention to detail and quality. I'm sure many of the folks in the room here who've actually worked on the Spring framework have come back later to find a little comment that says polish. And that's the little mark that he leaves. I know there's hundreds, if not thousands, of these little polish comments throughout the Spring code base. In fact, I think the team now has taken to saying that when this happens to them, they've been polished. I'd actually like to coin a new phrase for that. And I've actually made myself a t-shirt. So we're going to stop calling it polished, and we're going to start calling it Juergenized. So I can sell you those t-shirts if you'd like one. I'm the proud owner of the first one. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, my great privilege. Please welcome him, Juergen Hoeller.
Hello. Welcome also from my side. Happy to actually do the introduction to the Spring I/O platform section in tonight's keynote. There's quite a bit to be covered at this conference, as you've already heard. And for tonight's keynote, we decided to focus on where we are with the Spring I/O platform, what the Spring I/O platform means to you these days. So my job for today is actually to revisit the Spring I/O platform arrangements. This is what we introduced last year. The Spring I/O platform is an arrangement, a perspective that you can take onto what we are offering. It's basically an umbrella term around all the open source projects that we are doing. We decompose the platform into two layers, the foundation layer and the execution layer. The foundation layer is basically the Spring open source projects as you know them, the classic projects, some newer candidates in there, such as Reactor, of course also Groovy, foundational parts of the overall offering. The execution layer is where most of the new work goes into these days, where a lot of effort has been poured into the arrangement as well. There's, of course, the famous Spring Boot, a central part of the execution layer. These days, not just in the middle of the arrangement, it's actually a cross-cutting part of the execution layer. It's hosting other parts of the execution layer. Spring XD, for example, is heavily built on Boot. Even the next generation of Grails is being re-engineered, re-architected onto Boot. So our Spring Boot efforts really become very central in this overall arrangement. The platform itself can also be seen from a slightly different perspective. Let's look at it as a tree. If the platform was a tree, then there are a lot of dependencies, a lot of third-party dependencies, open source projects that we integrate with coming in from the bottom, basically the root of everything. They go into the most important part of the tree, the trunk, where Spring Boot is a key piece in unifying what we're doing, basically providing you with a central entry point. The execution layer in the Spring I/O platform is all about entry points, convenient entry points into the offering, and Boot is holding it together at this point. The Spring I/O platform distribution is basically a versioned arrangement around it, on top of Boot. It's an arrangement of harmonized dependencies. Just imagine how many open source projects we're integrating with. There are many, many of those projects, almost all of them optional in many combinations, many versions, many generations of those projects out there. The process of curation, where we are trying to harmonize those dependencies into a unified platform offering, which is basically an arrangement that cross-cuts all of those projects with predefined versions that have been tested, have been harmonized in the sense of all of our open source offerings, depending on the very same artifacts in terms of the third-party dependencies. And on top of it all, Spring XD, Grails, they are consuming this offering. They are building on those harmonized dependencies. So if you use one of our entry points from the top, you'll get all the benefits of this harmonization process. And there are plenty of things to be built with these offerings, all the applications. So this tree, of course, is growing. This tree is alive, right? We are in the process of evolving the platform, and you guys are in the process of hopefully being consumers of the platform, with this platform providing a service to you that allows you to more easily build reliable, evolvable applications on top. Now, this is basically the idea that we have for this vision that we have for the platform. Concretely, we've released the 1.0 generation this year. So there's already a Platform 1.0 generation based on the Spring Framework 4.0 baseline, with enormous efforts having gone into the harmonization for this initial platform release. There's really an unbelievable harmonization process behind this that hopefully doesn't show, but pays off for you in the end. Where's this going? We're currently at 1.0.2. Just last Friday, we've released a maintenance revision, picking up the latest open source maintenance releases. So this is basically Spring Framework 4.07, Spring Boot 1.1.6, and so forth. In a curated form, in a harmonized form, bundled in the Spring I/O platform 1.0.2 distribution. Our next iteration is 1.1. So we are using minor revisions. The minor revisions pick up releases such as Spring Framework 4.1, Spring Boot 1.2, the next minor revisions of the foundational key projects, and also, of course, of the execution layer key projects. So this is to be expected in November. It's all looking good. And towards next year, we are aiming for a Spring I/O platform 2.0 revision, which allows us to be a little bit more aggressive in some of the dependency updates, being based on new reactor versions and so forth. It has yet to be defined when exactly 2.0 will drop, but it's planned for the first half of 2015. Generally, we intend to do 6-month iterations for the minor releases and hopefully around 12-month iterations for the major releases, following along with our typical open source release cycle. And as you may be aware, of course, our open source projects don't all release at the same time. Spring Framework is more conservatively managed. Spring Boot releases pretty aggressively these days. So the platform also provides you with a unified version arrangement, unified iteration arrangement, where you're slightly decoupled from the underlying open source projects in terms of when and how they release on their own. All right, this is basically our immediate plan for the Spring I/O platform evolution. This is a process that's ongoing, of course. Part of the value that the platform provides to you is that it guides you along in its evolution. So if you're a Spring I/O platform user, a Spring I/O platform consumer, please follow along. This is part of the process. All right, let's move on to the Spring I/O execution layer. A key piece in the execution layer, of course, is Spring Boot. So please welcome Dave Syer on stage, who's going to cover the latest and greatest in Boot.
Thank you. And by the way, Juergen will be back tomorrow night at the Keynote to give you a bit more detail about some of the Spring Framework 4.1 changes. So I'm here to update everybody on what we've been doing with Spring Boot. Last year, I was on stage basically announcing the first milestone, or the first couple of milestones release of Spring Boot. It was very much the latest, greatest thing, and I just want to sort of share a couple of stories about what's happened through the year. I think it's been a huge success. I wonder if I could just do a show of hands. How many people in the room say they write code? How many developers do we have? All right, now put your hand, no, hands up, hands up. Hands down if you don't use Spring. A few, okay. Hands down if you've never used Spring Boot. That's not bad. There's still quite a few up there. Now, the rest of you, I want you to come back next year. And I want those hands up. No, and I'll tell you why, right? Because I'm not forcing you to do it, but it really will help, I believe. And I can tell you a couple of stories that prove it. We've had so much really good feedback since last year. We had a whole string of 1.0 releases. We got to 1.1 at some point at the end of last year. We're now 1.1.6 as of last week. And everybody who uses it basically says, you know, it makes it fun again. It's a joy to use Spring. And that was something that was, you know, changing, needed to change. It was changing in the wrong direction at the time that we decided to do this. So loads of people have said that. And I guess one thing that struck me in particular is that the Spring engineering team, all these guys sitting here, who you should, ask about the experience yourselves, just bump into them and ask them. The Spring engineering team have adopted Spring Boot wholeheartedly. Not a single one of them, I don't think, is a late adopter. They all went straight for it, and they picked it up, and they loved it, and they used it. And I didn't have to tell them to do that. Right? There wasn't a big corporate message saying, you guys, you have to use Spring Boot. It's the new thing. Everybody just did it. And I can tell you, I don't think there's a team of that size. I don't think there's a team of that size that's so different, so widely and differently talented. How can I put it diplomatically? I wouldn't like to be their manager. Looking at Brian, he does a really great job. So anything that they do together is a surprise, frankly. And was using Spring Boot gratifyingly for me as one of the sort of designers and authors was really great to see them all using it. Okay, so that was a little bit of retrospection. We are at 1.1.6. We have now probably climbing roughly 80, 90 contributors, which is actually a really good thing and a relatively new phenomenon for Spring projects. I have so many contributors very early in the cycle. I think Spring Framework might, definitely exceeds that, but we've only been doing it for less than a year, really, and we've got, getting on for 100 contributors, so that's good. Okay, so those of you who didn't use Spring Boot, what is it all about? It's in the execution layer, so it's about writing apps. And for me, it isn't about making it fun. And for me, it's about eliminating boilerplate. Now, Spring is always about eliminating boilerplate, right? It's the code that you don't write that's important. That's what the Spring engineering team do. We write the code for you. And this is the specific task that we have really with Spring Boot is to eliminate the configuration that you used to have to write. That's the way that we make things easy and the way that we do that ebb and flow thing that Hugh was talking about. So that's what it is, if you didn't know. You probably, if you did know anything about Spring Boot, you've seen an example like this. It's the tweetable app, right? So it's a Spring MVC REST controller. It's written in Groovy just to make it executable with the minimum amount of code. So this is an app that runs, all right? That's the important message. You don't need a Maven POM file. You don't need a build.gradle. You don't need a directory structure. You don't need anything. You just need this file and a command line. And that's what I'm going to show you. Some of you may have seen demos like this before, but I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to make it perhaps a little bit interesting, a little bit forward-looking, so it's not just the demo I did last year, it's going to be slightly different, okay? Let's see if I've got anything in that directory at the minute, so I'll just delete that file so that I can start from a blank canvas. I think somewhere I've got that slide, all right? So I can save myself some typing just by copying that. The Twitter birds were angry last year when I used Emacs, so I'll do it in VI. Can everybody see that? Whoops, sorry. Oh, shouldn't have used VI, obviously. Start again. There we go. Sorry, I was just trying to increase the font size at the same time as typing, which wasn't good. All right, there we go. It's a REST controller. It's going to do hello world in a browser, right? Spring MVC, pretty much everybody uses it, so I probably don't need to explain that. One thing I'm going to do here is pause, though, and I'm going to do which Spring, so that I know that I'm running the right thing. And I'm going to explain what it is that I'm looking at as soon as I can type it. Okay, so there's I use GVM. Some people use that. Some people use Brew if you're a Mac OS user. It's a way to curate different versions of Spring Boot. So I've got a version which is called Spring Boot Cloud, and the reason for that will become apparent soon. Basically, what that means is that I've got Spring Boot standard 1.1.5 distribution, and I've souped it up a bit. All right, so if I type Spring and hit Tab on the command line, you can see some new commands here. You can see install, uninstall, you can see encrypt, and you can see decrypt. So I'm doing some new stuff. And how did I do that? It's actually really fantastically easy. I think I can demonstrate that. There we go. So there's, from my command history, I've got a command that says Spring install, Spring Framework, Spring Cloud. So Spring Cloud is a term that I'm going to come back to. So what I've done is I've just told Spring Boot CLI the Maven coordinates or Gradle coordinates, whatever you want to call them, of a jar file. Okay, and what it's done is installed that jar file and its dependencies in my Spring Cloud, Spring Home directory. So what did that do? Well, it added a bunch of commands, so I can do encryption and decryption. That's nice, because I'm gonna want to hide my passwords in my properties files. That's really what it's about, punchline, but I won't show that tonight. Mainly what I'm going to show tonight is what happens when I run it. Okay, so if I run that app, and remember, Spring Boot is about convention over configuration is a large part of what we do. And so the way that your app behaves can depend and does depend quite a lot on what is on the class path. So what is on the class path is now different because I've added those plugins. So I've got an app which I'm going to load in a different browser here, 8080, just to show, is that really what I just wrote? Yeah, it is what I just wrote, isn't it? Yeah, okay. You want to check? There we go. Message, hello world, and there's my HTML. So that's actually no surprise, right? I mean, that is the demo I did last year, pretty much. But there's some other cool stuff there, right? So watch this. If I reload this page a few times, it is actually reloading, right? I could show you the HTTP traces, but nothing's happening over here. I'm not logging anything. So I just got frustrated. There's something wrong with my app and it's not logging. What do I do? Well, I've got a solution for you now. People have asked us for this so many times. If I curl localhost env, and I'm just going to do logging.level org.spring framework.web equals debug. Anybody see any spelling mistakes? No. Okay, so that told me that it changed. Okay, now, fingers crossed, if I did type it right, there we go, debug logging. Isn't that nice? So that was just done with a little trick of adding some stuff to the class path, and that's really what Spring Boot is about. All right, it's really cool. There's a load of features I just added. I can't show you them all. If you come to the talk that Spencer Gibb is giving with me on Wednesday, you will see loads of stuff that we're doing in there. I did want to do one quick other thing with this demo. Very quickly, I'm going to edit it again, and I'm going to add another nice feature. I wanted to do a demo, oops, at enable. So I wanted to do a demo where I deployed the app to Cloud Foundry, right? PWS is our public Cloud Foundry, so I'm going to show you how to do that, and make it do something different. Okay, something interesting. Well, something interesting probably is a single sign-on for all users of the app and other apps on the platform. So that's just an annotation that does that by virtue of the fact that all the stuff has been added to the class path, right? So I think I could run that, but instead of running it, I'm going to jar it, jar app.groovy, which involves compiling it, so I know that what I did is valid. And then I'm going to cf push. Everybody knows about Cloud Foundry a bit, right? Cf push just means I'm going to make an app called demo, and I'm going to make it from this app.jar. And I'm already signed in with some Pivotal Web Services credentials, so it's going to go to run.pivotal.io, which I can show you here maybe in the browser. So console.run.pivotal.io is where you see your apps that you've deployed there. So while it's doing that in the background, I'll just show you. I've logged in. There's two spaces, one called development, which is full of a load of cruft that everybody at Pivotal and the Spring team uses, and one that I've got for myself, for my demos here, actually. And there's my new app, demo. It's actually not running yet, so there's no surprise, but it's there, right? I'm seeing the app in the console while it's deploying. really I'm just doing this to cover the fact that it takes 30 seconds or so to upload it and run it. And I know Ben's working on that, but here we go. So I'm pretty sure that'll start quickly. There, okay, right. So that's my URL there. Okay, I'm going to load that. Oh, it wants me to log in. That's surprising. Hello world. All right, so that's the same app, but I added a cool new feature just by, adding some stuff to the class path. And actually, here's the reveal. Key thing is this app has, can everybody see this okay? It's got a service bound to it. Do I need to increase the font size there? It's got a service bound to it called SSO. So I'm using a naming convention, convention over configuration. A service called SSO tells me how to log in, and that's what it's done with that annotation. That's the end of the demo. I thought that was pretty cool, but there's more coming because I'm going to do more tomorrow. So you haven't seen the last of me yet, I'm afraid. Couple more slides as well, actually. Can I switch back to the slides just while I introduce the next speaker? Okay. All right, pause. Actually, I forgot about this one. If you want to see more Spring Boot, then it's basically everywhere in this conference because everybody will be using it for demos. I said it was popular. But I picked out a few that specifically talk about the technology behind Spring Boot, and so here's some, one of which I will be doing, which is the web tier one, Spring Boot for the web tier. Beautiful applications with Spring Boot, that's a nice one with Josh and Phil. I won't read them all out, but there are several things. Look for the keyword boot in the title of the talk. So with that, I want to call on my good friend Andy Glover from Netflix, who we've been kind of playing off together for a few months now. We inspire them a bit, they inspire us. We've been doing some cool stuff together, and Andy's going to tell you a bit more about it. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Thanks to the great folks at Pivotal for allowing me to join you all tonight, and special thanks to Jay Zimmerman and crew for putting on another fabulous Spring One. And actually, even bigger special thanks to all the Netflix customers out there. We love you. Please feel free to binge all week. This is going to be a great week in Dallas, and I'm honored to be here with you tonight. I want to take you back to 2004. That's right, 10 years ago. And in fact, 10 years ago, Netflix was still a DVD company. Facebook had actually just launched. Struts was the de facto state-of-the-art web framework for Java developers. Groovy was just getting off the ground. And Spring had just released 1.0. But in particular, in that year, there were two books that were published. One was Better, Faster, Lighter Java by Bruce Tate and Justin Getlin. And the other was Rod Johnson's J2EE development without EJB. And in my opinion, those were seminal books at that time. And it was arguably a turning point for the world of Java. Because I think we had finally admitted to ourselves that we had lost something. We had lost speed. And leaders in the community were saying what we implicitly all knew. EJB, and in many ways, the Java ecosystem wasn't all that agile. Nimbleness was sadly lost. Think back to the simple Hello World app in Struts and how many classes we had to create, interfaces we had to implement, XML files we had to define. And then if you wanted to hook that simple Hello World app up to a database, and you dared to use something like EJB, the number of classes you had to deal with was unfortunately a lot. And there was a couple Snickers out there, so I know a few of you had to do that. So why does it matter? Why is it a big deal? Well, it turns out that speed is actually very, very important. Speed is a competitive advantage. The ability for a business to competitively move fast, to introduce new products, to handle customer issues, to change in the face of market adjustments, all of this is a competitive advantage. And it's not just a startup concern. In fact, Roland Ford, who is the former CIO of Walmart, by the way, is the #1 company on the Fortune 500 list for 2014, and was also #1 in 2013. And so he was the CIO a number of years ago, and he was quoted as saying, quote, "The only competitive advantage becomes the speed aspect. Organizations need to keep embracing innovation and new technology models. At the end of the day, it's about getting from point A to point B quicker than everybody else." So, you see, no matter how big your business is or what market you are trying to dominate, speed is the killer app. And I think we all know this anyways, and that's largely why Spring has been so successful. 2 years after its 1.0 release, Spring won the Jolt Productivity Award. For those of you old enough to remember, Interface 21 was founded. Shortly thereafter, renamed to SpringSource, went on to acquire a bunch of companies and itself be acquired, and that's why we're all here today. History was made. But the lack of nimbleness in the Java ecosystem, it takes a little while to get out there. It's changing an ecosystem is like turning a battleship. It takes a long time. And around that time, something else was brewing. And in fact, in 2005, Rails was, I guess you could say, unleashed. And regardless of your opinion of Ruby or Rails, you'll have to admit the emergence of Rails changed the playing field. I like to think to myself, if Rails had not been introduced, would Grails be around? And with a few years of gaining traction in the development community, it's hard not to overlook the fact that Rails had kind of bifurcated the community, and a lot of people jumped ship, went to greener pastures. And they didn't leave the JVM because they thought Rails was better. They left because they thought they could build things faster with Rails. And in fact, I was one of those people. And in 2010, I was asked to lead a venture-backed startup to build a mobile application management system. And we did it. We selected Rails. And we took ideas on a PowerPoint deck and transformed them into a software as a service platform in 6 months. And we were able to close a number of large companies, including the US Air Force, USDA, Bristol-Myers Squibb, and a lot of other big enterprises looking to solve their mobility challenges. So in essence, you can say we bet the farm on agility, on high velocity. We bet the farm on Rails. And it paid off. And in fact, we were out of the gate before many of our customers were. Excuse me, not our customers. Actually, we were out of the gate before a lot of our customers were, too. That was part of the problem. But we were out of the gate before a lot of our competitors. And as we grew in customers and grew in technology, we even adopted Node.js in an ever-increasing kind of desire to innovate as fast as possible. But as our code base grew, we began to notice a couple gaps. And first and foremost, one particular part of our architecture became a monolith. What started out as a simple Rails app became an untenable beast of dependencies that ultimately felt like a drag. Releases, bug fixes, minor improvements to simple screens required, a fire drill, a big bang effort to release. And what we had also noticed is that we had begun to decompose a number of aspects of our architecture on the other side of the equation, so to speak, and built tiny services that we felt were facilitating rapid development. These things were easier to test and enabled us to work in parallel work streams. and releases didn't require a big bang coordinated effort. But we also learned a really, I think, deep lesson, an additional lesson to all this. As our operating environment grew in size and complexity, we felt like we lacked a solid base. For example, when we had to deal with concurrency, we found ourselves porting these services to the JVM. Detailed monitoring of our services required a lot of work. There wasn't any out-of-the-box operationalization of these services. So while Ruby and Node.js are absolutely super fun platforms to rapidly build applications, you lose the trusted and mature foundation that is the JVM. So fast forward, I came to Netflix late last year, and I was tasked with doing two things. The first one was to build an amazing team, some of who are here. And the second one was to solidify Netflix's continuous delivery platform. And at the time, we had two applications that were beginning to show the signs of monolithism. In fact, in some cases, we were unable to move at the pace that our customers wanted us to. So it became apparent that if we wanted to get into a place where we could rapidly innovate, we needed to break the monoliths up into small, succinct services. But we needed to do it on a credible foundation where we could count on real concurrency, legitimate monitoring, and reliable and easy service discovery, as well as great runtime performance. So with the JVM as our bedrock, we closely looked for a framework that would give us rapid velocity and a steadfast operationalization out of the box. And as you probably guessed, we zeroed in on Spring Boot. That's right. That's right. Spring Boot makes it super easy and quick to make Spring-powered production-ready services without a lot of code. The famous Hello World app in a tweet is a radical departure from what it took to do the same thing 10 years ago. Out-of-the-box functionality or non-functional features like security metrics, health checks, embedded servers, externalized configuration made Boot kind of a no-brainer for us. So Spring and Spring Boot are the foundation of Netflix's new continuous delivery platform. What's more, other teams at Netflix are following our lead because they too see the myriad benefits of Boot. I'm here to tell you that Spring Boot is the better, faster, lighter Java that we wanted 10 years ago. And as we approach the end, I guess it's maybe 6 months away, but we're closing in on 2015. This blew my mind, but it's helpful to remember that the Java platform has been around for 18 years. And Spring has been around for 10 of those years. The Java ecosystem is extremely reliable. It's alive and well, and the JVM is the steadfast cornerstone for any production-ready app. So I want to clarify my earlier assertion about velocity is the killer app. Don't get me wrong, rapid innovation is certainly a competitive advantage, but there's one more thing I'd like to add, and that is velocity on the JVM. That is the true killer app. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. That was great. So Andy more or less set things up for the rest of today and tomorrow's keynote as well. But I'm just going to say a few things. I heard the word there, microservices there, it's out there. You might not like the term, some people don't, but I mean, the fact is that it's a meme, and it's probably here to stay. It's kind of an architectural style that people like our friends at Netflix are basically proving that it's effective by winning in the market, right? So that's basically speaking for itself. So it's great, right? It's a really nice way to build systems. I don't want to call them apps, really, systems. But people have noticed, right? There's been a lot of debate about this recently. You can't fail to miss it. It's not going to be that easy, right? You don't just break things up into small pieces and they just work. It's not a completely free lunch. So that sort of, that should be interesting for us. Why? Because many of the problems that you encounter when you start deploying and building systems composed of services is that you notice that there are boilerplate patterns, right? Things that you do over and over again. And that's good for us, right? Because that's what Spring is. Spring is all about removing boilerplate. So we have the foundation layer and the I/O platform, which is about business logic. So all the boilerplate code that you used to write in 2004, you no longer have to do. JDBC template does it for you. The execution layer is relatively new, but that's configuration, right? The runtime concerns for a single JVM-bound process. That's removing boilerplate from configuration. So now we've got another layer. We're going up the stack, basically. And we're going to think about, I'm not sure if this is the right word for it yet, but we've debated it a lot. We came up with coordination. The coordination layer of Spring I/O is patterns in distributed systems. We've noticed that there are such patterns. The guys at Netflix noticed it as well, right? They've got a bunch of open source projects, which we're going to be talking about in some detail, Spencer and I, on Wednesday, and also tomorrow night at the keynote. So there are some patterns, some boilerplate patterns that we can help you with. So going back to the tree, right, Juergen's tree, it's growing all the time, and it's growing at the top there, in the canopies. Those little leaves, those little apps, they want to talk to each other. They don't just stand alone and solve a single problem and that's all they have to do. They need to coordinate. They need to have some glue. And so that's what we're doing, basically. We're adding some glue for you. That's our new effort for 2014, 2015. So I was here last year to tell you about Spring Boot. I'm here this year to tell you about Spring Cloud. Now, Spring Cloud is a brand that we already use for something else. So what we've done with it, actually, just last week, is expand it. So the thing that Ramnivas worked on, which you may have used or heard of at least, was Spring Cloud is now a sub-project. So it's a bit like Spring Data. Spring Cloud is a new umbrella, which we're going to put loads of stuff in. More details about that tomorrow night at the keynote, basically, and also on Wednesday. So it's going to be boilerplate patterns, putting the power in the hands of the developer to build systems out of microservices, not just to build the services themselves, but to build a system of coordinated and cooperating services. So to place that, I guess, in the layer cake, because everybody likes to see that. I don't think there really are layers. That's the problem. They never were anyway. But we can put it somewhere on there just to make sure that it's visible. So Spring Cloud, we couldn't really decide where to put it on this diagram. So I'm not going to be able to explain its role very well using this. The tree was better. Right, the tree actually shows you things being glued together. That's where it really works. And also because it sits on top of Spring Boot. It's another set of tools using Spring Boot. You saw me using the CLI plugin in my last demo. So that's just an example of it. Some of the features that we can add using a beautiful approach, to use the phrase coined by Josh. So that's introducing a new concept, basically, the coordination layer of the Spring I/O platform. More on that tomorrow and on Wednesday. So to move on and continue to tell the story of the Spring platform as a whole, I need to invite somebody else onto the stage. So Graeme Rocher is one of the big cheeses in the Groovy and Grails world. He's the Grails lead, and he's going to tell us all about what's happening at the top layer of that stack in a sort of Groovy corner, where Grails and Groovy lives. Cheers, Graeme.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be back to Dallas. Not a lot of people know this, but this is the first time I've been back to Dallas in 20 years, and the last time I was here, I actually lived here. I lived a year in Dallas when I was 15. I went to high school in Capel High School in Dallas, and I remember some of my best memories was finishing school and then going to the Dallas Cowboys training ground, which was really close to where I used to go to school, and checking out the Dallas Cowboys training. There were some pretty good players back then. I remember seeing Troy Aikman and Emmitt Smith and checking them out play, and it was I mean, I'm no American football expert. It was a completely new thing to me, obviously not being from here, but it was a fantastic experience at the time. So it's great to be back in this great city. And thanks again to Jay for putting it on in this great venue. Okay, so I'm tasked with giving the updates on the Groovy and Grails side. And starting off with Groovy, I'm going to run through with you just a little bit about what's happening in Groovy 2.3, and then what's coming up in Groovy 2.4. So Groovy 2.3, the main focus around Groovy 2.3 was Java 8 support. So, and this is not just in terms of the syntax, but obviously Java 8 introduces this whole the whole new world of lambdas. And of course, Groovy has had closures as part of the language since right from the beginning. So this is nothing new if you're a Groovy developer. But obviously, with the whole new infrastructure around lambdas that comes with Java 8, Groovy has had to evolve itself to make sure that the Groovy APIs work also seamlessly with the Java 8 APIs. And I can tell you that, as you can see from the example there, the latest Java 8 APIs with streams work seamlessly with Groovy code and Java code. So that's great. A lot of great work has gone into the Groovy 2.3 release in this area. Then the other big feature. So Groovy 2.3 introduces the notion of traits. So what are traits? Traits are essentially behaviors that you can compose together. They're equivalent. They're kind of similar to interfaces. It's that they can have default implementations, and they can hold state. So that, as you can see in this example here, you've got two traits, one called flying, another one called speaking, and you can have a class that implements both. And the traits themselves can hold properties and state. They act largely like a mix-in, but the benefits are they're compatible with compile static. So you can annotate the class with compile static, and they're actually wired into the bytecode. And all Java code in your code base is completely aware of traits. So they fit seamlessly into your Groovy and Grails, Groovy and Java mixed code base. So that's Groovy 2.3 traits. Also in Groovy 2.3, and this is something that we've been particularly excited about, there's been a huge amount of collaboration between the Spring Boot team and the Groovy team, and a huge amount of innovation. You've seen that with Dave demonstrating the Spring Boot CLI, which is an extremely exciting area of Spring Boot. It's been really phenomenal to see the collaboration between the Spring Boot and the Groovy team. And one of the new features of Groovy 2.3 is a brand new template engine, which is usable inside the latest Spring Boot. So you can actually define templates in using a markup builder-like syntax. And it completely supports type checking, has built-in support for layouts, and it's supported in Spring 4.1 and Spring Boot. So you can have it in Spring Boot, there is an auto configuration enabled that automatically understands Groovy templates. So it's a pretty exciting feature and an expressive way to specify views in your Spring Boot application. Now, in terms of Groovy 2.4, the exciting area that's coming up here is around Android. With Groovy 2.4, you'll be able to develop Android applications completely in Groovy. A huge amount of work has been undertaken by the Groovy team to make Groovy compatible with Android, so that you can write Android applications in Groovy, built with the Gradle plugin, and deploy them onto an Android device. And it works completely seamlessly. A lot of work that went into compile static and static compilation of Groovy code is obviously linked in here. And there's a whole lot of innovation that is going into Groovy to make sure that the bytecode is smaller and optimized for the Android JVM, and that Groovy performs to an adequate standard on an Android device. And we're already seeing the fruits of this labor in real-world scenarios. The New York Times recently posted a blog post on their website explaining how they are using Groovy to develop the latest version of the New York Times Android application. So we're extremely excited about that. Also, a big area of focus for Groovy this year has been around about these housekeeping and infrastructural chores. So you may have not noticed by going to groovy-lang.org that there is a shiny, brand new website that looks fantastic, and is the website that Groovy has deserved for years. A huge improvement over the old infrastructure. It's completely statically generated, so the source code for the website is all on GitHub. If you want to contribute, it's a great area that you can contribute to the language. Just go to GitHub, check out the documentation, make tweaks, send a pull request, and the Groovy team is great at reviewing, providing feedback, and merging those changes in. There's still a lot of work to be done on the new documentation as well. The new documentation is completely powered by ASCII Doctor, but it's now the definitive documentation for Groovy as we move past the old wiki-style documentation. And it's, again, a huge amount of effort has gone into that documentation, and we're super excited about seeing all of these infrastructural and documentation and website resources coming together. So a lot of exciting stuff going on in the Groovy community. Okay, now let's go on to Grails. So on the Grails side, there's really two streams of work happening at the moment. Grails 2.4 is the current production release of Grails, and we recently put out 2.4.3. We're continuing to maintain that, and we'll be releasing 2.4.4 and various 2.4.x releases to continue to maintain that. The plugin community is also continuing to innovate. It's staggering, really, that Grails now has over 1,150 plugins in the plugin ecosystem, and new plugins are continuing to be developed. The other mainstream of work is what's coming in Grails 3, and we are undertaking a complete rewrite of the framework on top of Spring Boot. You may have already seen, heard that being mentioned by Dave. And it's a super exciting area because it's going to be built on top of the Spring I/O platform. We've already spent a large amount of time developing it, and it's coming together nicely, which you'll be able to see in a minute. So as I said, Grails 3 will be built on top of Spring Boot. It'll form part of the Spring I/O execution layer. We'll have full support for microservices, Spring Boot-style microservices, traditional deployment as a WAR file, fat jar deployment, embedded. We'll have native Gradle and Maven support, and it's, as I said, a ground-up rewrite on top of Spring Boot. Some of the goals we want for Grails 3 is to maintain our plugin model, make it more event-driven, have integrated support for multi-project builds via Gradle, support for microservices, and this notion of application profiles. So we don't want Grails to be tied into a box of only being able to develop traditional WAR-style applications. We want all of the benefits of Grails to spread across different application types, whether it be netty deployment, traditional servlet, batch, a whole different range of use cases. We also are removing a lot of bloat and legacy from the framework. Grails itself, next year, will join the 10-year-old club. So after 10 years of development, you do accumulate various craft that will have the great pleasure of removing in Grails 3 and providing migration path for our users. We're reducing external dependencies, making Grails much more lightweight, much more easier to embed and use on a smaller scale from microservices, and allow scaling from being able to build those just small micro applications to what I like to call as a modular monolith, where you could potentially have a larger application if you built in a modular way. And in terms of the plugin architecture, we're trying to separate Grails, because right now a Grails plugin in the 2.x line essentially spans 3 areas, where you have code gen on one side, plugin behavior on one side, and runtime behavior on the other side. And currently, a Grails 2 plugin can contribute to all 3 of these areas. And although that sounds nice on paper, and it's very convenient, what ends up happening is the 3 areas leak into each other. So for Grails 3 plugins, we're providing a clear delineation between what a plugin is able to do between the Gradle build, the code generation, and the runtime behaviors. And providing clean APIs so that a runtime plugin can't interact with build, and splitting it out properly this time, really rethinking how plugins work for Grails 3. And Grails 3 will support microservices. So you saw the Hello World example in a tweet for Spring Boot. So what we have here is a complete database-backed REST application in a tweet. And I would like to give you a demo of that in action right now. So if we can just switch to the demo. OK. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this from the PowerPoint presentation. Yeah. And I'm going to essentially open up I've already got an app.ruby there, just like Dave had one before. And we're going to open this up. Paste that in there. So there's my application. And using the Spring Boot CLI, we can just say spring run app.ruby. So over here, I've essentially got a Grails domain class annotated with an entity and mapped as a REST resource to the books URI. And once that's started up, I can essentially post data to it. There we go, came back. I can do a get, yeah. So let's get a resource. There it is. So as you can see, I've got a complete database-backed REST resource in, well, 8 lines of code. Pretty cool stuff. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to enable for Grails 3 in terms of microservices. But then we've also been hard at work on, as I said, the Gradle build and extending Grails 3 to be built on Gradle. And I've got another app here, which is a Grails app. As you can see, this is a more traditional style Grails app. A new 3.3.0 application with the Grails app directory, the controllers directory, all the traditional kind of Grails style development. And so for all intents and purposes, this is just a Grails app, except we have a build.gradle. And what I can essentially do is just do Gradle run on this app. And as you can see, it's powered by Spring Boot. There it is, up and running. And if I go to localhost, there's my Grails app, Grails 3 application running on Spring Boot with Hello World, my REST resource controller. And the cool thing about this is you get all the additional features of Grails. So I can do a Gradle assemble. And this will essentially build a jar file, which then you can do java/jar build libs. Just run the embedded jar, and again, Spring Boot takes care of the rest. But because Grails is built on top of Spring Boot, we get all those benefits of running as an embedded jar, as a fat jar, and that's it. My application running as just a jar file, which you can chuck anywhere and just run with java/jar. Okay. So that was the demo. So there's a lot of interesting Groovy and Grails sessions as well. Just pointing a few out. Guillaume and Cedric and members of the Groovy team are going to be doing a lot of great Groovy talks. I'm going to do a more comprehensive Grails 3 preview tomorrow at 10:30. So make sure you check that out. There's also some interesting services and Grails. And in terms of different application architectures, you might also want to check out Ratpack and Grails, which make an interesting combination. So make sure you check that out. And with that, thank you very much.